Hi, I'm Shannon Gavin Johnson, the Director of Legacy Museum on Main, and this is a brief moment in LaGrange's history. Many of the foods that we cover in our latest exhibit, Gather Round the Table, Troup County's Culinary History, became Southern favorites after long and convoluted journeys from exotic origins. This is not the case with pecans. Pecans are indigenous to the lower Mississippi Valley, primarily eastern Texas and Louisiana, but by the time of European colonization, Native Americans had spread pecan trees over much of the Southeast. Pecans are one of our more recently domesticated crops. Both Thomas Jefferson at Monticello and George Washington at Mount Vernon had enslaved people plant pecan trees, which they called Illinois nuts. But commercial pecan production only began around 1880 when grafting techniques were improved. Before that time, almost all pecans consumed in the United States were collected from wild trees. In 1833, newlyweds Joel D. and Mary Middlebrooks Newsom started construction of a magnificent Greek Revival-style home, which at the time was about 5 miles from LaGrange on Big Springs Road. The estate became known as Nutwood because of the tradition that the first pecan tree planted in Troup County grew on that place. 50 years later, on August 23, 1883, the editor of the LaGrange Reporter lamented that there were only 2 known pecan trees in Troup County, and he urged his readers to plant more. Almost as early, the pecan was featured in cookbooks. In 1824, Mary Randolph offered a recipe for a milk-based pecan custard in her cookbook, The Virginia Housewife, and in 1896, Harper's Bazaar published a similar recipe. Some early Texas recipes called for molasses as the custard base, but it wasn't until the 1920s when the makers of Cairo syrup printed a simple recipe on their label that pecan pie soared in popularity. Other delicacies made from the nut were also popular very early in American history. For example, pralines, the delicious concoction of pecans, sugar, butter, and cream, were first created in France and brought with Ursuline nuns to New Orleans in 1727. The nuns were chaperoning a group of casket girls, or young women from orphanages and convent schools that the French government sent as potential brides for colonists. The girls carried everything they owned in a small trunk called a casket, and nuns accompanied them to instruct them in domestic duties and to ensure their virtue. As the casket girls married and spread across the South, they combined their training with local traditions to create the foundation of Creole cooking. One of their adaptations was substituting locally available pecans for almonds in the praline recipe. By the mid-19th century, pralines were so popular in New Orleans that women, mostly of color, supported themselves selling candy on the street corners in the French Quarter. As for the nut's pronunciation, the word comes from the French pecan, which in turn is borrowed from the Algonquin Indian word pecani, meaning large or hard nut. If you grew up in New Orleans or along the Gulf Coast, you probably say pecan or praline. If you grew up elsewhere in the South and here in LaGrange, you probably say praline and pecan. To learn more about this interesting nut, visit our latest exhibit at Legacy Museum on Main. This has been a brief moment in LaGrange's history.